think everybody is familiar with the alien abduction scenario. After all, we've heard it reported countless times before. But besides abductions, we often hear of very strange encounters with these unearthly beings. These encounters are very hard to understand because their actions just seem so pointless and bizarre. The following is a collection of alien encounters that do not fit into the abduction scenario, but rather describe more baffling behaviours which are exhibited by these extraterrestrial intruders. My young daughter recounted an unnerving experience she had when she was 5. We were camping at Snake River Campground, Minnesota, and this happened at night while I was sleeping. She was with my niece in an adjacent tent about 8 feet from mine. In the morning she told me that a very short, naked and bald old man came into the tent and lay down next to her. She said he laid there pretending to be asleep, but that she knew he was faking it, and that he just laid there. She said he was bothering her because he was, quote, a liar and a faker. The only part of this that I witnessed was hearing her yell, "You faker, get away. If Mummy sees you, she will shoot you." At this point, I saw a small shadow cut across behind the tents, thinking it was a small animal. In the morning after she described it to me, we packed up and headed home. Gun or not, I didn't want to find out whatever this thing had in mind for my little girl. I've got to give her points for gumption. Most adults, including me, would have wet their pants. She also said he was all, quote, icky grey or brown coloured and really wrinkly. I've only heard a few accounts of greys of this type. Firstly, this story is creepy whether or not this was an alien or human in the tent with the little girl. Recently in Australia, a young 4-year-old girl was abducted by a man from a campsite. Luckily she was found and reunited with her family. Also recently there have been reports of people breaking into homes while the residents are asleep at night and just watching them or their children sleep. They steal nothing and don't touch the sleeping people at all. They just watch them and then leave. So as I read this last report, my mind jumped on the idea that this might be something similar. I thought maybe it could be a mentally ill or drug-affected person acting out in the same way as these Australian offenders I just mentioned did. But the descriptions of the size of the person opens up the possibility of an alien experience. You might say, why the hell would an alien travel across the stars and come to Earth just to lie down next to a sleeping child? And that is a fair question. However, if you are familiar with alien reports, you would know that aliens are often reported acting very bizarrely, with actions that just seem pointless and kind of strange. And as you'll see in this video, they have been observed simply watching people or everyday common objects with an intense curiosity. The description of wrinkly skin on the alien is interesting too. Abductee and researcher Suzy Hansen and others have described encountering beings who match this description.
Now, it isn't the first time that I have seen beings like that one that I showed you that was on the left in the previous slide. This is from another experience I had where I was taken on board, wait for it, a rectangular box-shaped craft. Where are you? Okay, and a number of people, heaps of people around the world have seen box-shaped craft. But I was taken on board for some kind of interview, lecture with a being that looked like this. And so we see the same cloak-like material that's covering a very lined, very wrinkled body, a different stock from the grey that I put up originally at the beginning of the presentation. And I'm not the only one who's seen these kinds of things. This is a drawing done by Alice Taylor, who's a very good friend of Mary Rodwell's, lives in the UK. And I've met Alice, and Alice has a virtually identical drawing, same kind of lined face and lined body and cloak-like garment. and he calls his wise being, and certainly that was the aspect that I was shown, that these were very, very advanced beings, and that they did not often communicate directly with humans.
My husband, with great trepidation and discomfort, has related the following story to me a few times. I'll call him Will in this story. Will was raised on the East Coast in a large city, very urban and very poor. When this happened, his family lived on the second floor of a crappy apartment building. He shared a bedroom and a bed with his little brother, John. At the time of the incident, he was 8 and his brother was 6. They were asleep, and the room was dark except for the flashes of red, yellow, and green of the traffic light outside the open window. Will says he woke up suddenly to see a small grey man in the corner of the room, staring, preoccupied, at the traffic light outside. The man turned and looked at Will, and Will saw that the man was wearing shades. Will tried to scream, but his voice was frozen, and nothing came out. At this point, John woke up and stared over Will's shoulder as the grey man stood there briefly, then slid along the wall and disappeared out the window. Then, their voices unfrozen, they both started screaming. When their mother came in, they wouldn't tell her what they saw. John stuttered when he spoke from that night on. He still stutters, and he's in his late 50s. I didn't believe Will at first, so one day I called John and asked if it was true that Will and he had seen an alien once when they were kids. John went silent on the phone, then said he didn't want to talk about it. He sounded petrified, so I ended the call. Neither Will nor John are prankster types. They are both serious and logical types. I believe it happened. Will says that when he sees grey aliens with the large eyes depicted on TV or in magazines, that is actually what he saw. The shades were the large eyes. A couple of times Will told me, again with great discomfort, that in his teens he was sitting on a park bench when he felt, rather than saw, something above him scanning his brain. No lie, he says pictures, numbers, and words were flipping through his mind at an incredible speed. Then it stopped, just that quick. But he remained very energized for a couple of days after. He doesn't like to discuss these incidents. I don't know why, but I do believe it's all true. We were spending the weekend about 13 years ago at my wife Pam's grandmother's cabin in Happy Jack, Arizona, up on the northern rim. Happy Jack is about 2.5 hours northeast of Phoenix and is heavily wooded. There are a few small communities of cabins in this area, but mostly the area is uninhabited and crisscrossed by forestry service roads that run for miles all over the area. Elk run free, as well as livestock from a few cattle ranches in the area. The area is amazingly gorgeous, and we would ride our ATVs on the narrow dirt forestry roads for hours during the days we spent at Pam's grandmother's cabin. In the evenings, my oldest son would always want me to take him out driving in his grandfather's early 70s Chevy Blazer. He was about 13 years old at the time, and the Blazer would be his on his 16th birthday. So I would allow him to drive the vehicle on the miles of forestry roads that ran through Happy Jack, with me in the front passenger seat, monitoring his progress. We would head out from the community of cabins that Pam's grandmother lived in, travel the forestry roads for a couple of miles, and finally through an area called Windmill Canyon, which led to another community of homes. We then would get to the highway, at which point I would take over and drive for the next few miles back to the cabin. This was a ritual that we went through every evening, as my son was eager to learn to drive. So late one afternoon, about half an hour before sunset, my oldest son Josh, as usual, hopped into the driver's seat of the Blazer. I got into the passenger seat, and our two other sons, aged 10 and 7, were in the back, along for the ride. We had been driving for a little over an hour. The sun had set, and we're driving down a very narrow area of forestry road, not well maintained, with a downhill grade of probably 10%, and trees crowded on both sides. The going was very slow, and the uneven road made me worry that if Josh went too fast, he might hit a tree. So I was cautioning him as he drove, and my eyes were glued to the road ahead. As we entered a clearing and the road was levelling off, in the headlights we saw a small figure standing upright in the middle of the road, about 15 to 20 yards ahead of us, as I remember. What we saw is embedded in our minds, and I can see it now like it happened yesterday and not 13 years ago. The creature was extremely thin, standing upright, and of a grey or white colour. It was about 4 to 5 feet tall at the most, and completely naked. No clothing could be seen. The head was large for its body, the arms and legs long and thin. It looked like the classic grey alien. My son slammed on the brakes and the two kids in the back started screaming, and I was friggin' petrified. There was no way that we could back up that narrow inclined road. The only way to go was forward. The figure looked at us, and we looked back for about 5 seconds or so. And then the creature crossed the road to the left and began walking towards the heavy tree line, about 15 yards beyond the clearing. When it crossed the road, my son immediately drove forward into the clearing, and we watched the creature as it entered the tree line and disappeared. Just before it entered the trees, it turned and looked back at us. At this point, we were all basket cases, and all we wanted to do was get the hell out of the area. I knew that about 1.5 miles up the road, heading into Windmill Canyon, was a cattle gate that would need to be opened, and so with my son in the driver's seat and I in the passenger seat, it would be me to be the one who had to jump out and unlatch the gate. I didn't want any of my sons leaving the vehicle. As we approached Windmill Canyon, I was relieved to find the gate open, as I, to be honest, was terrified to leave the vehicle. I was dreading having to get out. We entered Windmill Canyon, and the forestry road at this point was well maintained, and we could drive at a much faster rate than prior. As my son drove on, we noticed a red light in the trees following us and keeping pace. There were no cabins in this area. It was completely uninhabited, and there was nothing to explain the light that followed us and kept keeping pace. All we saw was the red light moving through the trees, keeping pace with us. I would estimate the light itself to be probably 3 to 4 feet in circumference. If it was attached to anything, we could not tell. All we could see was the red light. The light kept pace with us as my sons in the back were crying, and Josh and I were terrified. I didn't want to stop Josh and take over the driving for fear that the light might move in on us. Fortunately, at this point, Josh had become a pretty good driver. As we were about to leave Windmill Canyon and enter the next community of cabins, the light began to slip back and finally blink out or head off. I'm not sure which. We were just happy to get back into an inhabited area. I think you will find this next story, the last story, rather interesting. Some of the text has a storytelling feel to it, which may give it a slight air of fiction for some. However, in my opinion, this is just the writing style of the author. Some people have more of a flair for telling a story than others, and I believe this might be the case here. I'll leave it up to you, the listener, to decide on the veracity of this story for yourself. I have experienced a large amount of paranormal phenomena in my life. However, most of these events are easily explained as tricks of the mind, or misidentification. So I've chosen to go through life believing that there were scientific explanations for these events, but all of that changed one evening in the autumn of 2013. My apartment was on the second story of a motel-style apartment complex, so we had a shared balcony that was always well lit for tenants to find their doors at night. There was a large sliding window on each side of the front door. I would always keep these locked with the shades down so nobody could look into my apartment as they walked by. As you walk through the door, there was a dividing wall that started about 8 feet directly in front of the door. This formed a U shape, with the living room on the right side of the U and the kitchen on the left. Both are visible from the door. To go from the living room to the kitchen, I would have to walk towards the front door, then turn around and walk into the kitchen. This is important for understanding my story. I was in my living room, playing Halo with my best friend. I was sitting on the side closer to the front window. I suddenly had the most intense feeling that I was being watched, way more intense than I have ever experienced before. It was so intense that I was able to pinpoint exactly where the person was watching me from. I knew that on the other side of the living room window, I would find someone watching us. At this point, my wife had already told me several stories about someone outside who was messing with her while I was at work. She said they would stomp back and forth, tap on the glass, knock on the door, and once, they even tried turning the doorknob. So when I felt this person watching us, I was livid. Now, most humans are not perceptive of energy fields, but the descriptions that my wife had given me did not match the behaviour of most humans. There were times when I had even heard the footsteps myself. They sounded very small, as though a 3-year-old was goose-stepping in combat boots. So when I felt this person watching me, I knew that I had to make sure not to tip them off. I needed to catch them in the act. When hunting animals, pro hunters have started wearing special suits designed to muffle the electric signals we generate with our bodies. Highly perceptive animals can detect your intentions through your EM field and run away before you even know they were there. So I decided in that moment that I needed to mask my energy signal to avoid scaring off my prey. I filled my mind with the thought of being thirsty. I became so incredibly thirsty that my throat even began to feel dry. I put down the controller and started walking towards the kitchen. My alarmed friend, who was now being swarmed by mythic-level Covenant, asked me, "Dude, what are you doing?" To which I replied, "I need water bad, man." I had specifically taken a wide arc path to the kitchen. When I had reached the apex of the arc, I was about 5 feet from the window, and I could still detect the presence of an intensely focused, peeping Tom. I pounced. I quickly jumped over the window and ripped open the blinds with zero concern for my security deposits. And it was in that moment that I made the most startling discovery of my entire life. Standing on the other side of the glass was a child-sized, grey-skinned biped. He had been intensely focused in the direction of my wife, who was playing on her phone about 30 feet away. The creature, who I will refer to as a he for ease of discussion, suddenly jumped back in shock. My instincts wanted me to jump back myself. I had a strong urge to rub my eyes in a cartoonish fashion, but I overpowered these urges. I refused to miss this once-in-a-lifetime chance to see a real alien. I did not move a muscle. I did not blink. I did not even breathe. I stared intensely at my peeping Tom and studied every detail from head to toe. I was not about to be shaken by the most intense fear I had ever felt in my life. It was then I had made the realization that my new friend was not as naked as he first appeared. Aside from his child-sized stature, his features were also very youthful. He had not a single wrinkle or blemish. Upon closer inspection of his skin, I realized it was not exactly grey. It was more of a pearlescent blend of blue and white that created the appearance of grey. He was wearing a dull, metallic grey jumpsuit that almost blended with his skin, causing him to appear naked. He also had some very advanced equipment on his person, all in the same metallic grey colour. On his forehead, he was wearing a set of rather bulky-looking goggles. On his arms, there were some very advanced-looking arm braces. Around his waist was a nifty-looking utility belt. But on his feet was a child-sized pair of black combat boots. "It was you," I had thought to myself in my head. We had stared at each other for less than 15 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. We were both just in shock at being face to face. His tiny mouth was now opened wide enough to fit a nickel. His large, black, baseball-sized eyes were somehow even larger now. After about 10 seconds of this, he slowly backed away. Then he slowly reached over to his arm bracer and quickly pressed a button with his 5-fingered, pearlescent grey hand, and in that instant, he was gone. He didn't turn invisible or fly up into a mothership. There were no flashing lights or loss of time and memory. He was simply just gone. It was as though he had left reality altogether. I could no longer feel the intense energy of his presence. Just gone. Then I gave myself permission to breathe. I blinked rapidly and rubbed my eyes. I checked again, but he was still gone. I'd even thought of going outside to look for him, but then I advised myself not to open that door. I turned around and realized that the 2 other people in the room were now staring at me in confusion. "What's wrong, dude? You look like you saw a ghost," my friend said. Then my wife added, "Yeah, I've never seen your face look so white before." I was speechless. I was completely unable to form words and say them. I was barely able to stand. I walked my shaky, rubbery legs over to my chair before collapsing in it. I then stared at the wall for a good 5 minutes, while my wife and friend prodded me for answers. I eventually snapped out of catatonia and told them what I saw. To this day, neither one of them will talk about it with me, but I know it was real. There is 0 doubt in my mind. I now believe that reality is much stranger than fiction.